The neon sign of the Broken Spoke Saloon buzzed like a dying fly against the Texas twilight, casting long red shadows over the dusty parking lot where a storm was brewing on a small, cracked iPhone screen. The air inside the legendary honky-tonk was thick with the smell of stale beer and history, a place where the floorboards had been polished smooth by generations of boots shuffling to the rhythm of a fiddle. But tonight, the attention of the few patrons at the bar was not on the stage, or the cold long necks in their hands, but on the glowing device resting on the sticky mahogany counter. A young cowboy with a hat that looked too new to have seen a real day of work tapped the screen with a calloused finger. His face twisted in a mixture of disbelief and cynical amusement as he turned to the older man beside him, a man who had actually lived through the eras the music spoke about. The video playing on the phone was grainy, a relic from a time when recording meant bulky camcorders and magnetic tape, but the image was unmistakable. It was 1984, the year George Strait went from being a promising singer to a mythological figure in the American West, and the camera was zoomed in with a shaky, intrusive violence on the side of the stage. There, amidst the cables and the darkness, sat Norma Strait, her face illuminated by the harsh blue spill of the stage lights, and she was weeping. Not the delicate tears of a proud wife watching her husband conquer the world, but the heaving, desperate sobs of a woman whose heart was breaking in real time, while just 10 feet away, George stood with his back to her, singing a ballad about love and loss. The video cut abruptly to a modern studio, sleek and sterile, where a man with bleached hair and eyes that gleamed with the predatory hunger of a vulture leaned into a high-definition microphone. This was Brad the Truth Teller, a digital executioner who made his living dismembering the reputations of the past for the entertainment of the present. Brad's voice was smooth and poisonous as he spoke over the frozen image of Norma's tear-stained face. "You think you know the king of country," Brad sneered, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "You think he is the last gentleman, the cowboy who opens doors and tips his hat. Look at this face. Look at Norma. That is not pride. That is a woman trapped in a nightmare. That is a woman crying for help, while her husband ignores her to soak up the applause. Today we are going to expose the secret that George Strait has hidden for 40 years. The video ended and looped back to the beginning, the sound of Norma's silent scream echoing in the quiet bar. The older patron pushed his beer away, a look of profound disgust settling on his weathered features, because he knew that in this new world, truth was not what happened, it was what got the most views. Miles away from the neon glow of the Broken Spoke, in a place where the only light came from the stars and the soft yellow warmth of a farmhouse kitchen, George Strait sat at his dinner table, unaware that the ground beneath his feet was shifting. The ranch was his sanctuary, a fortress of solitude, built on hard work and the rhythm of the seasons. Here he was not the king, he was just a man who worried about rainfall and the price of feed and the health of his horses. He was 70 years old now, and the years had been kind to him, etching lines of character into his face rather than weariness. He had finished a long day of fixing the north fence, a task he could have paid a dozen men to do, but chose to do himself, because the physical labor kept his mind quiet and his soul tethered to the earth. He wiped his hands on a napkin, his movements slow and deliberate, the movements of a man who had nothing left to prove to anyone. Across the table, Norma was serving a simple roast, her movements mirroring his, a silent dance of partnership that had lasted more than half a century. They did not need to speak to communicate. A glance meant pass the salt. A slight nod meant the coffee was good. It was a peace earned through fire and time, a peace that felt impenetrable until the screen door slammed open and the outside world came rushing in. It was their granddaughter, her face pale, her eyes wide with a panic that George had not seen since she was a child, afraid of thunder. She held her tablet against her chest like a shield, her breathing ragged, as if she had run all the way from the city. George set his fork down, his instincts sharpening instantly, the relaxed grandfather vanishing and the protector emerging. He did not ask what was wrong, he simply waited, his blue eyes steady and calming, demanding order from the chaos. She walked to the table, her hands trembling, as she placed the tablet on the checkered tablecloth between them. She did not say a word, she just pressed play. The silence of the kitchen was shattered by Brad's voice, loud and accusatory, filling the room with his toxic narrative. George watched the screen, his expression unreadable. He saw himself young and lean in a starch-pressed shirt, standing on that stage in 1984. He saw the smoke, the lights, the way he held the guitar. And then he saw the zoom. He saw Norma. He saw the tears. He heard the man's voice twisting, the moment turning a memory that was sacred into something sordid and ugly. The man on the screen was talking about emotional abuse, about narcissism, about a woman suffering in the shadow of a tyrant. George felt a coldness spread through his chest, not fear but a deep, profound sorrow for the cruelty of a world that would take a moment of pure humanity and paint it as a sin. He looked up from the screen and looked at Norma. Norma had stopped moving. She was staring at the tablet, her hand covering her mouth, her eyes filling with fresh tears that mirrored the ones on the screen from 40 years ago. But these were tears of shock, of violation. To have her private pain, her private moment of compassion dragged out into the light and mocked and twisted was a physical blow. She looked at George, and for the first time in years, he saw fear in her eyes. Not fear of him, but fear for him. She knew what this meant. She knew how the world worked now. She knew that once the fire started, it would burn everything down regardless of the truth. George reached across the table and covered her hand with his. His hand was large, warm and rough, calloused from the fence wire and the rains. It was an anchor. He did not speak immediately. He let the video finish. He let Brad ask his final damning question. If George Strait is such a good man, why was his wife crying in the dark while he sang? The video ended. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was heavy, charged. "Turn it off," George said quietly. His voice was low, a rumble that came from deep within his chest. His granddaughter tapped the screen and the room went dark again, save for the kitchen light. George stood up slowly, pushing his chair back. He walked to the window and looked out at the darkness of the ranch. He could see the silhouette of the barn against the stars. He could hear the wind moving through the mesquite trees. It was the same wind that had blown in 1984, the same stars, but the world under them had lost its mind. He thought about calling his publicist. He knew exactly what they would say. They would tell him to issue a statement, to deny it, to threaten a lawsuit, to ignore it and let it blow over. They would use words like damage control and brand management, but George Strait did not have a brand. He had a name, and that name had been given to him by his father, and he would pass it on to his son and his grandchildren, and a name was only as good as the truth attached to it. He turned back to the room. Norma was wiping her eyes with a napkin, trying to compose herself, trying to be the strong woman she had always been. "They are saying you hurt me," Norma whispered, her voice breaking. "They are saying you didn't care, that I was miserable." George looked at her and his heart clenched. He hated seeing her in pain. He hated that a stranger in a studio 1,000 miles away had the power to make her cry in her own kitchen. He walked over to her and placed a hand on her shoulder, squeezing gently. "We know the truth, Norma," he said. "We know what happened that night." Norma looked up at him, shaking her head. "It doesn't matter what we know, George. Look at the numbers, look at the comments. Millions of people, they believe it. They think you are a monster. They are rewriting our life." George looked at the tablet again. The view count was climbing by the second. The comments were scrolling so fast they were a blur of hate. Cancel George Strait. Typical toxic cowboy. Save Norma. It was a mob, a digital lynch mob, hungry for blood, hungry to tear down a statue just to see the dust settle. George felt a spark of anger then. Not the explosive rage of a young man, but the cold, hard resolve of an old lion who has been bitten by a jackal. He was not going to let them do this. He was not going to let them turn a moment of supreme love into a story of abuse. He was not going to let them dishonor the memory of why Norma was crying. He was not going to let them dishonor Sarah. The name rose in his mind like a prayer. Sarah. He hadn't spoken her name out loud in years, but she was always there, woven into the fabric of their lives. To leave this lie unanswered was to betray Sarah. It was to betray the promise he had made to her in that hospital room. It was to betray the very song he had been singing that night. "I'm going to go there," George said. The words hung in the air, simple and absolute. Norma blinked, confused. "Go where?" "To the lawyers, to the office." George shook his head. "No, I am going to go to him, to this Brad. I am going to his studio." His granddaughter gasped. "Pop, you can't. That is what he wants. He wants a fight. He will twist your words. He is a professional manipulator. You can't go into his territory. It's a trap. George walked to the hook by the door where his hat hung. It was a resistor, pristine and white, the symbol of a code that the world seemed to have forgotten. He took it down and turned it in his hands, feeling the felt, the shape of the brim. "It is only a trap if you have something to hide," he said calmly. "I have nothing to hide, and I will not hide you, Norma. I will not let them use your tears to sell their lies." But Norma stood up, her hands gripping the back of the chair. "It is live, it is the internet. You don't understand how they fight. They don't fight with fists. They fight with edits and context and mockery. They will humiliate you." George put the hat on, adjusting it until it sat low over his eyes, shading his face. He looked like the cover of 100 albums, but he also looked like a man who was about to ride into a storm to find a lost calf. "I understand enough," he said. "I understand that a lie travels halfway around the world while the truth is putting on its boots. Well, my boots are on, and I am going to catch up to it." He looked at his granddaughter. "Find out where this studio is. Call them. Tell them I am coming. Tell them I want to sit in the chair. Tell them I want to watch the video with him." The drive into the city the next morning was silent. George drove his own truck, a heavy-duty pickup that smelled of diesel and leather. He did not take a driver. He did not take a security team. He took his granddaughter, who sat in the passenger seat, clutching a folder of documents, her face pale with worry. She was scrolling through her phone, giving him updates he didn't ask for. "It's trending #1 globally, Pop. Everyone is waiting. Brad is already promoting it as the takedown of the century. He says you are coming to beg for forgiveness." George kept his eyes on the road, his hands steady on the wheel at 10 and 2. The Texas landscape rolled by flat and wide, broken only by fences and mesquite. He loved this land. He loved the honesty of it. If you didn't water the grass, it died. If you didn't fix the fence, the cattle got out. Cause and effect. There was no spin in nature. But as they got closer to Austin, the landscape changed. The open fields gave way to strip malls and subdivisions, and then to the glass towers of the city. It felt foreign to him now, a place of noise and hurry. He thought about 1984. He thought about the smell of that arena, the cheap cologne, the popcorn, the stale smoke. He remembered the heat of the lights. He remembered looking down at the front row. He remembered the wheelchair. He remembered the face that was so pale it looked almost translucent. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel. The memory was sharp enough to cut. He had sung thousands of shows since then, millions of faces, but that night was burned into him. He remembered the specific vibration of the floorboards when the crowd roared, but mostly he remembered the silence in his own heart as he tried to keep his voice from breaking. And now this boy, this Brad, was taking that holy silence and filling it with noise. They arrived at the studio building, a modern monstrosity of steel and reflective glass that looked out of place against the soft blue of the Texas sky. There were already cameras outside, paparazzi, kids with phones. As George turned the truck into the lot, he saw them swarm. They were like ants on a dropped candy. He put the truck in park and turned off the engine. The silence inside the cab was a brief respite. He looked at his granddaughter. "You got the letter?" he asked. She nodded, patting her bag. "I have it." "And the tape?" She nodded again. "It's all here." "But Pop, are you sure? You don't have to do this. We can turn around. We can release a statement." George opened the door. The sound of the crowd rushed in. "No," he said, stepping out his boots, hitting the pavement with a solid thud. "Statements are for politicians. I am a singer, and today I have one last song to sing." He walked through the crowd. He did not stop. He did not smile. He touched the brim of his hat to the ladies, but he kept moving his stride, long and purposeful. The cameras flashed blindingly, but he didn't blink. He was used to flashes. He had lived half his life in the flash, but this felt different. These weren't fans, these were spectators at a gladiator match, waiting to see the old lion fall. He reached the glass doors, and they slid open with a hiss. Inside, the air conditioning was freezing cold. The lobby was white and minimalist. A young woman at the front desk looked up, her eyes widening as she saw him. She had probably been expecting an entourage, a team of lawyers, a wall of muscle. Instead, she saw an old man in Wrangler jeans, a button-down shirt, and a cowboy hat, standing alone with a young girl. "Mr. Strait?" she stammered. George nodded. "I believe Mr. Brad is expecting me." They were led down a long corridor lined with posters of other celebrities Brad had destroyed. It was a trophy hall, a gallery of fallen idols. George looked at them and felt a pang of pity. Not for the celebrities, but for the man who built his castle on their ruins. They reached the double doors of the main studio. A red light above the door said, "On air." The assistant opened the door, and George stepped into the belly of the beast. The studio was dark, lit only by aggressive strips of neon purple and blue. In the center sat a glass desk that looked like a spaceship console. Behind it sat Brad. He was younger than he looked on screen, smaller. He was wearing headphones that looked too big for his head. When he saw George enter, he didn't stand up to shake his hand. He grinned a shark-like grin and pointed to the camera. "Ladies and gentlemen," he shouted into his microphone, his voice booming through the studio speakers. "The king has arrived to abdicate his throne. Welcome to the slaughterhouse, George Strait." George did not flinch at the introduction. He walked to the empty chair opposite Brad and sat down. He did not adjust the microphone. He did not check the lighting. He just sat and looked at the young man. Up close, he could see the sweat on Brad's upper lip. He could see the nervous energy. The boy was terrified, but he was masking it with arrogance. George placed his hands on the table. He looked at the camera lens, the red eye that was beaming his image to millions of people around the world. He didn't see the millions. He saw Norma sitting at the kitchen table. He saw Sarah in her wheelchair. He took a breath. So George Brad began leaning forward, his eyes gleaming. "Let's cut the pleasantries. We all saw the video. We all saw your wife crying. We all know what that looks like. That is the face of a woman who has given up. Why don't you tell us what you did to her? Why don't you tell us why the man who sings about love was torture to live with?" Brad pressed a button, and the video began to play on a massive screen behind George. The giant image of Norma sobbing loomed over them. The sound of the song Amarillo by Morning filled the room, distorted and mocking. Brad paused the video on the most painful frame. "Look at her," Brad demanded, pointing a pen at the screen. "Defend that. Explain to me how that is love." George looked at the screen. He looked at his wife's face, frozen in anguish. He felt a lump in his throat, but he swallowed it down. He turned his gaze back to Brad. His voice when he spoke was not loud, but it had the weight of a mountain. It silenced the hum of the equipment. It silenced the snickering of the crew in the back. "Son," George said, and the word was not affectionate, it was a reprimand. "You have good eyes. You saw the tears. You saw the pain. And you are right about one thing. That is not the face of a woman watching a concert. That is the face of a woman watching a tragedy." Brad blinked, surprised by the admission. "So you admit it? You admit you caused this? You admit you were the tragedy?" George shook his head slowly. "No, son, I wasn't the tragedy. I was just the soundtrack. You have the video, you have the pixels, you have the zoom. But you made a mistake that city boys often make. You looked at the picture, but you didn't look at the frame. You didn't look at what was just outside the shot. You see my wife crying, and you assume she is crying for herself. Because in your world, that is the only reason people cry. For themselves, for their own pain, for their own likes, for their own followers. But Norma comes from a different world, a world where we cry for others." Brad laughed, a nervous, high-pitched sound. "Oh, please. The altruism defense? You expect us to believe she was crying for charity. That is pathetic, George. Even for you, that is a spin doctor's fantasy. Who was she crying for then? The economy, the weather?" George reached into his pocket. The movement was slow. Brad flinched as if expecting a weapon. But George only pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was yellowed with age, creased 1,000 times. The edges were soft and worn. It looked like a relic from another century, which it was. He placed it on the glass desk. The sound of the paper hitting the glass was softer than a whisper, but it felt like a gavel coming down. "She wasn't crying for me," George said, his voice dropping an octave, intimate and devastating. "And she wasn't crying for herself. She was crying for the girl sitting in the wheelchair directly in front of her. The girl whose hand she was holding. The girl who isn't in your video because your cameraman was too busy looking at the star to notice the angel in the front row." Brad looked at the paper. He looked at George. He looked at the live viewer count, which was freezing as the world held its breath. "Who?" Brad asked, his arrogance slipping just a fraction. Who was in the front row? George unfolded the letter. His hands shook slightly, not from age, but from the memory of the girl who had written it. Her name was Sarah, George said. She was 23 years old. She was a single mother of 2 babies, and she had stage 4 cancer. The doctors gave her 2 weeks. She didn't want money. She didn't want a trip to Disneyland. She wanted to hear me sing Amarillo by Morning one last time. She said it was the song she danced to at her wedding before her husband left her. She wanted to feel that feeling one last time before she died. George looked straight into the camera lens, piercing the digital veil. We flew her in. We put her in the front row. We paid off her house so her babies would have a roof over their heads. And that night I wasn't singing to the crowd. I wasn't singing to Norma. I was singing to Sarah. And Norma wasn't crying because I was ignoring her. She was crying because Sarah was holding her hand and squeezing it with every ounce of strength she had left. She was crying because she was watching a young mother say goodbye to the world while I sang about a rodeo I would never see again. The studio was dead silent. The crew had stopped moving. Brad's mouth was slightly open. The narrative he had built, the intricate castle of lies, was trembling. But he was a fighter. He was a creature of the internet. He couldn't lose. He couldn't let the old man win with a sob story. Prove it, Brad snapped, desperate now. That is a nice story, George. Very touching. But words are wind. Anyone can write a letter on old paper. Where is the proof? You say there was a girl. Show me the girl. You can't because she doesn't exist. This is a PR stunt. George looked at Brad with a mixture of sadness and steel. He didn't get angry. He signaled to his granddaughter. She stepped forward out of the shadows and placed a small cassette tape on the desk. It was an audio cassette, the kind used in soundboards in the 80s. It was labeled in black marker, Dallas 1984, board mix. George placed his finger on the tape. You have the video, son, George said, but you don't have the audio from the floor. You don't hear what was said between the songs. You don't hear the microphone that was left open near the stage. Do you want to play it? Or are you afraid that the truth will ruin your show? Brad looked at the tape. He looked at the comments. The chat was screaming, play it, play the tape. He was trapped. If he refused, he looked like a coward. If he played it, he risked everything. He grabbed the tape, his hands sweaty. He handed it to the sound engineer. Play it, he snarled. Let's hear this magical proof. The engineer loaded the tape. The speakers hissed with the static of time. Then the sound of a crowd roared. Then George's voice, young and clear, singing the final notes of the song. And then silence. And then a voice. George's voice from 40 years ago, breathless and emotional. This is for you, Sarah. You are the prettiest rose in Dallas tonight. God bless you, darling. And then another voice. Closer to the mic. A woman's voice. Norma's voice, thick with tears but clear as a bell. She is smiling, George. Look at her smile. She is so brave. I can't bear it, George. She is so brave. And then a third voice, weak and faint, but audible. A young girl's voice. Thank you. Now I can go. Thank you. The tape clicked off. The silence in the studio was absolute. It was a holy silence, the kind of silence you hear in a church after a prayer. Brad sat frozen in his chair. The color had drained from his face. The giant screen behind George still showed Norma crying, but now the image looked different. It didn't look like abuse anymore. It looked like love. It looked like the purest, most heartbreaking form of love imaginable. The comments on the screen had stopped moving, and then they exploded, not with hate but with hearts, with tears, with apologies. The mob had turned. The truth had put on its boots, and it had kicked the door down. George sat back in his chair. He didn't gloat, he didn't smile. He just looked at Brad, who seemed to have shrunk 3 sizes. You see, son, George said softly, you look for the darkness because that is what sells. But sometimes the light is so bright it hurts your eyes. And that is what you saw on Norma's face. You saw the blinding light of compassion, and you mistook it for pain. The silence that followed the click of the cassette tape was not merely the absence of sound. It was a physical weight that pressed down on the lungs of everyone in that glass-walled room. The hum of the server banks and the low-frequency buzz of the studio lights seemed to vanish, swallowed by the gravity of the ghosts George Strait had just summoned into the room. For a moment, time suspended itself. The image on the massive screen of Norma crying, was no longer a weapon, it was a shrine. The pixels that Brad had sharpened to expose a scandal now seemed to soften, glowing with a tragic beauty that no filter could manufacture. Brad sat paralyzed, his hands hovering over his keyboard like a pianist who had forgotten the music. His face, usually animated by the manic energy of a man hunting for clout, was slack pale and stripped of its mask. He looked at the cassette tape sitting innocuously on the glass desk, a small plastic rectangle that had just dismantled his entire career in 3 minutes of magnetic hiss. He looked at the chat stream on his monitor. Usually it was a river of toxicity, a place where trolls fed on blood. Now it was moving so fast it was a blur of color, but the words that caught his eye were devastating in their simplicity. "I'm sorry. We were wrong. God bless Sarah. Forgive us, George." The mob which Brad had whipped into a frenzy had turned, but they hadn't turned on George. They had turned on their own cynicism, and by extension they were beginning to turn on the man who had fed it to them. George did not move. He did not lean back in triumph. He did not smile that crooked, charismatic smile that had graced 1,000,000 album covers. He sat with the stillness of a mountain watching a storm pass. His hands were clasped on the table in front of him, resting near the old letter. He looked at Brad not with hatred but with a profound and weary disappointment. It was the look a father gives a son who has broken something he can never fix. "Is that enough, son?" George asked. His voice was gentle, but it cut through the room like a serrated knife. "Or do you need to see the death certificate? Do you need to see the mortgage papers? Because I have those too. I keep everything. When you live a life of telling the truth, you don't have to worry about shredding documents." Brad swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. He tried to summon the persona that had made him famous, the ruthless inquisitor. He tried to find an angle, a loophole, a way to spin this back into a controversy. But his throat was dry, and his mind was blank. The reality of what he had done was crashing down on him. He hadn't just insulted a celebrity, he had desecrated a dying girl's last wish. He had taken a holy moment and dragged it through the sewer. Brad stammered, his voice cracking on the live feed. "I didn't know. The source said you were fighting. They said Norma was hysterical." George nodded slowly. "The source saw what they wanted to see, just like you did, just like everyone watching this did. You saw a woman crying and you assumed pain because you live in a world where pain is the only currency. You didn't consider love. You didn't consider sacrifice. You didn't consider that a heart can break from beauty just as easily as it can break from sorrow." George leaned forward, the leather of his chair creaking in the silence. "Let me tell you about that night. Let me tell you what you didn't see on that tape." George turned his eyes away from Brad and looked directly into the camera lens. He was no longer speaking to the host, he was speaking to the millions of invisible souls on the other side of the fiber optic cables. He was speaking to the generation that had judged him. Sarah was 23. George began, his voice taking on the cadence of a storyteller, a rhythm born of campfire tales and honky-tonk ballads. She had hair the color of corn silk, but she had lost most of it to the chemo. She wore a wig that night, a cheap synthetic thing that she was so proud of. She was a waitress from a diner in Fort Worth. She had 2 boys, Michael and little Tommy. Her husband had left her the day the diagnosis came back terminal. He took the truck, he took the savings, and he left her with a mortgage she couldn't pay and a cancer that was eating her alive. The studio crew, usually detached and ironic, were now leaning in. The camera operator was wiping his eye with the back of his hand. The producer in the booth had taken off her headset to listen. Norma met her first. George continued, a softness entering his eyes. "Norma was volunteering at the hospital. She does that. She doesn't post about it. She doesn't take selfies with the patients. She just goes and holds hands and changes bedpans and listens. She met Sarah, and Sarah told her she had one wish. She didn't want to die without hearing Amarillo by Morning Live. She said that song was the only thing that made her feel like she was free, like she was a cowboy riding away from the pain." Norma came home that night and she was crying. She told me, "George, we have to do something. We can't just sing for her, we have to save her peace." George paused, his gaze drifting to the side, as if he could see the memory playing out in the dark corner of the studio. "So we arranged it. We didn't go through the label. We didn't call the press. I drove my truck to the hospital myself. Norma helped Sarah get dressed. She was so weak she couldn't lift her arms. Norma did her makeup. Norma brushed that wig. Norma put her own diamond earrings on Sarah's ears and told her she was the belle of the ball. We had to carry her into the venue. We put her in that wheelchair right at the front. And I told the security guards, if anyone stands in front of her, you answer to me. Brad was looking down at his desk, unable to meet George's eyes. The shame was radiating off him in waves. That video you showed, George said, pointing a finger at the frozen screen behind him, where Norma's face was still twisted in emotion. That moment happened during the bridge of the song. I looked down, and I saw Sarah. She was in so much pain, son. The morphine was wearing off and I could see it in her eyes, but she was smiling. She was singing the words with me. And Norma. Norma was holding Sarah's hand so tight her knuckles were white. Sarah leaned over to Norma and whispered something. You want to know what she said? Brad nodded, barely moving. Yes, he whispered. She said, don't cry for me, Norma. I'm going to a place where the music never ends. Just promise me my boys will be okay. George's voice trembled just slightly, a fissure in the granite. And Norma looked at her and promised. She promised a dying woman that her children would not end up on the street. That is why Norma was crying. She was crying because she was making a covenant with a soul that was halfway to heaven. And you, George's voice hardened, returning to steel. You took that holy promise and you called it a toxic marriage. You took the most selfless moment of my wife's life and called it her humiliation. George reached into his shirt pocket again. This time he pulled out a checkbook. It wasn't a prop. It was an old leather-bound checkbook, the kind a rancher carries. He opened it and pulled out a carbon copy slip that had been tucked inside the plastic flap for decades. This is the receipt, George said, placing it next to the letter. The day after Sarah died, I went to the bank. I didn't send a manager. I went. I paid off the mortgage on her house. I set up a trust for Michael and Tommy. I made sure they went to college. I made sure they became men. I never told the press. I never told my label. I never used it to sell a record. Because charity that screams for attention isn't charity, son. It's marketing. And I don't market my heart. The impact of the words hit the room like a physical blow. Brad looked at the carbon copy. He saw the amount. It was substantial. In 1984, it was a fortune. And it was signed in George's distinct looping hand. For Sarah's boys. There was a commotion in the control booth. The producer's voice came over the studio speakers, urgent and breaking. Brad, we have a call. The screening system says it's Michael. Brad's head snapped up. Michael? Michael Reynolds, the producer said. Sarah's son, he's watching the stream, he wants to speak. Brad looked at George. George just nodded, giving his permission. Put him through. Brad whispered. The audio shifted. The crisp studio silence was replaced by the slight fuzz of a phone line. A man's voice filled the room, deep, resonant, and thick with emotion. Hello? Is George Strait there? George leaned toward the microphone, his face softening into a grandfatherly warmth. I'm here, son. I'm here. Mr. Strait. The voice on the phone broke into a sob. My name is Michael. I was 6 years old when my mom died. I'm 46 now. I'm watching this with my daughter. I wanted to tell that man sitting across from you something. Brad flinched as if he expected to be screamed at. You don't know what you're talking about, Michael said, his voice gaining strength. You talked about George Strait like he was some kind of villain. Let me tell you who George Strait is. He's the man who bought me my first bicycle because my dad wasn't there to do it. He's the man who sent a card every single Christmas for 20 years. He's the man who paid for my brother's surgery when he broke his leg. We didn't just have a roof over our heads because of him. We had a life. The studio was weeping now, not just the crew. Even the cynical hipster assistants were wiping their eyes. The narrative had been so completely inverted that the air in the room felt charged with electricity. And Norma. Michael continued, his voice trembling with reverence. Norma is the only mother figure I remember from that time. After the funeral, she came to the house. She cooked, she cleaned, she held us while we cried. That video you showed? That woman crying? That is the woman who saved my life. How dare you try to turn her love into something dirty? Brad buried his face in his hands. He was broken. The persona was gone. He was just a young man who had made a terrible, terrible mistake in front of the whole world. "Mr. Strait," Michael said, his voice softening, "I just want to say thank you. Again. For everything. And tell Norma. Tell her the boys are okay. We are okay." "I will tell her," Michael George said softly. "You take care of yourself. Give that daughter of yours a hug for me." "Yes, sir. Goodbye." The line clicked dead. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was the silence of a courtroom after the verdict has been read. Guilty. Brad was guilty of the worst crime in the age of information. He had assumed the worst of the best. Brad finally lifted his head. His eyes were red. He looked at George, and for the first time he looked like a child seeking guidance. "Mr. Strait, I don't know what to say. I have destroyed my credibility. I have destroyed this show. I deserve it. I am so sorry. I will take the video down. I will issue a retraction. I will quit." Brad made a move to take off his headphones to end the stream, to run away from the glare of the lights. But George reached across the desk. His hand, large and weathered, clamped down on Brad's wrist. It wasn't a grip of aggression. It was a grip of stabilization. "Don't you run, son," George said firmly. "You stay right there." Brad froze. "Why? Why would you want me to stay?" "I tried to ruin you. Because running is easy," George said. "Running is what cowards do. And I don't think you are a coward. I think you are just lost. You are part of a generation that has been taught to tear things apart to see how they work. You dissect heroes to find the flaws. You dissect love to find the lie. And you do it because you are scared. You are scared that maybe real things don't exist anymore. You are scared that honor is a myth. So you try to prove it's a myth so you don't have to feel bad about not having it." George released Brad's wrist and leaned back, adjusting his hat. "You made a mistake, a big one. But you are sitting in the chair. The cameras are still rolling. The world is still watching. And this is the most important moment of your life, not because you fell down, but because of what you are going to do next. You can run away and hide and let this define you. Or you can sit there, look into that lens and tell the truth. Not my truth, I already told that, your truth. Admit you were wrong, admit you were hungry for attention, and learn from it." Brad looked at George, stunned. You are giving me a chance? After what I said about Norma?" George smiled a sad small smile. "Norma would be the first one to tell me to give you a chance. She hates seeing people suffer, Brad, even the ones who hurt her. That's why she was crying in that video, because her heart is too big for her body. If I walked out of here and left you in the dirt, she would never forgive me." George stood up. The movement was stiff, his knees popping slightly, a reminder of the decades of rodeos and ranch work. He towered over the desk. He picked up the letter and the checkbook, but he left the cassette tape. "Keep the tape," George said. "Listen to it when you start thinking the world is an ugly place. Listen to Sarah's voice. Remember that there are things in this life worth more than views and clicks. There is kindness, there is loyalty, and there is love that doesn't ask for a receipt." George tapped the brim of his hat. A universal gesture of respect that felt like a benediction. "I'm going home now, son," George said. "My wife is waiting for dinner, and I suspect she's going to need a hug." George turned and walked toward the door. The camera followed him. The crew parted like the Red Sea, their heads bowed in respect. He walked with that signature gait, a slow, rolling stride that spoke of saddle time and patience. He didn't look back at the screens. He didn't look back at the chaos he had calmed. He just walked toward the exit, toward the Texas heat, toward the truck, and toward Norma. Behind him, Brad sat alone in the pool of light. He looked at the camera. He looked at the tape. Tears were streaming down his face, now real, unedited tears. He took a breath, shaky and raw. Brad began, his voice trembling. "I was wrong. I was so wrong." As George pushed open the heavy soundproof doors and stepped into the corridor, he could hear Brad's voice continuing behind him, beginning the long, painful work of redemption. But George wasn't listening anymore. He was already thinking about the drive home. He was thinking about the sunset. He was thinking about the woman who had sat beside him for 50 years, the woman whose tears had been vindicated not by anger, but by the simple, undeniable weight of the truth. He walked past the posters of the fallen celebrities in the hallway. He didn't look at them with pity anymore. He looked at them with hope. Maybe, just maybe, today had changed something. Maybe the world was tired of the noise. Maybe they were ready for a little bit of silence and a little bit of song. He reached the lobby. The receptionist was standing there holding a tissue. She looked at him with awe. "Mr. Strait," she whispered. That was the most beautiful thing I have ever seen." George stopped. He looked at her kindly. "It wasn't beautiful, darling. It was just the truth, and the truth is usually a lot simpler than we make it out to be." He walked out into the blinding Texas sun. The paparazzi were still there, but they were quiet now. They didn't shout. They didn't shove. They took pictures, but they kept their distance. There was a new respect in the air, a boundary that had been redrawn. George walked to his truck and opened the door. His granddaughter was already inside, smiling through her own tears. "Did we win, Pop?" she asked, as he climbed into the driver's seat. George started the engine, the diesel rumbling to life like a sleeping giant. "We didn't go there to win, honey," he said, putting the truck in gear. "We went there to set the record straight. Winning is for games. This was about life." He pulled out of the parking lot, leaving the glass tower behind him. He turned the radio on. By some cosmic coincidence, or perhaps the intervention of a DJ who had been watching the stream, the opening fiddle notes of Amarillo by Morning began to play. George didn't turn it off. He turned it up. He drove toward the horizon, singing softly along with his younger self, singing for Sarah, singing for Norma, and singing for a world that desperately needed to remember how to love without asking for anything in return. But the story wasn't over yet. The digital ripples were turning into waves, and those waves were about to crash onto the shores of his quiet life in a way he never expected. Because when you light a beacon of truth in a dark world, people don't just look at it. They start walking toward it. The tires of the heavy-duty pickup crunched over the gravel of the long driveway leading up to the main house. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the Texas sky in bruises of purple and burnt orange. It was the magic hour, the time of day George loved best. But tonight he felt the weight of every one of his 70 years settling into his bones. The drive back from Austin had been a blur of phone calls his granddaughter refused to answer, and radio DJs frantically dissecting the interview, playing his songs back to back as if he had just died and been resurrected. He parked the truck near the barn, the engine ticking as it cooled. The silence of the ranch rushed in to greet him, but it was different now. It wasn't just the absence of noise, it was the presence of peace. He stepped out, his boots kicking up small puffs of dust. He didn't head for the house immediately. He walked to the fence line where his favorite horse, a chestnut quarter horse named Whiskey, was grazing. He rested his arms on the wooden rail, looking out at the vastness of the land. The land didn't care about viral videos. It didn't care about trending topics. It only cared about rain and stewardship. The screen door of the farmhouse creaked open. George didn't turn around. He knew the sound of those footsteps better than he knew the chords to his own songs. Norma walked across the yard. She wasn't wearing the fancy dress from the 1984 video, nor the apron from the kitchen. She was wrapped in a simple shawl against the evening chill, her silver hair catching the last of the light. She stopped beside him at the fence. She didn't touch him at first. She just looked out at the horizon with him. Two souls watching the same sun go down. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. Her voice was steady, but there was a tremor in it, a vibration of overwhelming gratitude. "You didn't have to tell them about the money. You hate talking about money." George turned to look at her. Her eyes were red, but they were clear. The fear he had seen in the kitchen the night before was gone, replaced by a look of profound relief. "I didn't tell them about the money, Norma," George said, reaching out to tuck a stray strand of hair behind her ear. "I told them about the promise. The money was just paper. The promise was you." Norma let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for 40 years. She leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. He wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close, creating a silhouette against the sunset that no camera was there to capture. "Michael called me," she whispered into his shirt. "After the show. Sarah's boy. He's a grandfather now, George. Can you believe it? He sent me a picture of his granddaughter. Her name is Sarah." George smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening. Full circle, he murmured. It always comes full circle. He said... Norma paused, her voice thickening. He said that for 40 years, every time he missed his mother, he watched that video. Not the one Brad made, the original concert footage. He said he watched it because when he saw me crying, he knew his mother wasn't alone when she died. He said my tears were the proof that she was loved. George felt a tightness in his throat. The irony was staggering. The very image that the internet had tried to weaponize as proof of cruelty was, to the only person who mattered, the ultimate proof of love. Then we did good, George said simply. We did good. The days that followed were a whirlwind, but of a different kind. The waves George had sensed coming didn't bring destruction. They brought a flood of humanity. The ranch's mailbox, usually reserved for bills and feed catalogs, began to overflow. The local postmaster had to drive a special van out just to deliver the sacks of mail. They weren't fan letters asking for autographs. They were confessions. People wrote about the times they had judged a stranger, only to find out they were wrong. They wrote about their own Sarahs, the secret acts of kindness they had received or given. A movement had started organically and quietly. The hashtag #NongaTheNorma Standard began to trend, not as a celebrity gossip thread, but as a challenge. Before you judge the picture, look at the frame. Look for the love. And then a week later, a package arrived from Los Angeles. It was small, wrapped in plain brown paper. There was no return address, but George knew who it was from. He opened it at the kitchen table while Norma poured coffee. Inside was a high-tech digital hard drive and a handwritten note. The handwriting was jagged, scrawled by a hand that had been shaking. Mr. Strait, I resigned from the network yesterday. They offered me a raise to stay. They wanted me to do a follow-up to milk the redemption arc. They wanted me to interview you again. I told them to go to hell. I'm starting over. I don't know what I'm going to do yet. Maybe I'll go back to school. Maybe I'll just learn how to listen. But I wanted you to have this. It's the master file of the takedown video. I deleted it from the servers. I deleted the backups. This is the only copy left. Burn it, smash it, do whatever you want. Thank you for not destroying me when you had the chance. You taught me that being right is less important than being good. Sincerely, Brad. George looked at the hard drive. It was a sleek piece of metal, cold to the touch. It contained the digital poison that had almost infected his life. What are you going to do with it? Norma asked, setting a mug of black coffee in front of him. George stood up. I think the fireplace is hungry. He tossed the drive into the hearth where a fire was crackling. They watched as the plastic casing melted, the metal warped, and the digital lies were consumed by the honest, cleansing heat of a wood fire. It was unceremonious. It was final. But the true climax of the story didn't happen with the destruction of the drive. It happened a month later at the San Antonio Rodeo. George hadn't planned on performing. He was technically retired from the big tours, but the organizers had begged him. The city wanted to see him. They wanted to see them. The arena was packed. 20,000 people, a sea of cowboy hats and boots. When the lights went down, the roar was deafening. It wasn't the hysterical scream of a pop concert. It was the deep, guttural roar of respect. It was Texas welcoming its favorite son home. George walked out onto the rotating stage. He picked up his guitar. He approached the microphone. He didn't make a speech. He didn't mention the scandal. He didn't mention Brad. He just strummed the opening chord of Amarillo by Morning. The fiddle kicked in. The crowd sang the first verse so loud George didn't even have to use his voice. But when he reached the bridge, the music softened. The spotlight, usually fixed on him, began to move. It swept across the darkness of the arena floor. It moved past the VIPs, past the press pit, and settled on a specific seat in the front row. The seat was empty. George had requested it be left unsold. On the seat lay a single yellow rose. The crowd, seeing the spotlight on the empty chair, fell silent. They knew. The story had traveled far enough. They knew who that seat was for. George leaned into the mic. This one's for the ones who can't be here, he said, his voice echoing in the rafters, and for the ones who held their hands while they left. He looked to the side of the stage. Norma was there. She wasn't hiding in the shadows this time. She was standing in the wings, bathed in the soft glow of the sidelights. She wasn't crying. She was smiling, a radiant, peaceful smile. She raised her hand and touched her heart, looking first at the empty seat and then at her husband. George finished the song. The final note hung in the air, a high, lonesome sound that seemed to bridge the gap between 1984 and the present, between the living and the dead, between the truth and the lie. As the applause crashed down around him, a thunderous ovation that shook the very foundations of the building, George didn't bow. He took off his hat. He walked over to the edge of the stage, right in front of Norma. He extended his hand. Norma hesitated for a fraction of a second, then stepped out from the wings. She took his hand. He pulled her onto the stage, into the center of the spotlight. The crowd went wild, a frenzy of joy. But inside that circle of light, it was just the two of them. George placed his white hat on Norma's head. It was too big for her, tipping slightly over her eyes, just as it had when they were teenagers, fooling around behind the barn. He kissed her forehead. "I love you," he said, the microphone catching the whisper. "And I love who you are when you think no one is watching." Norma laughed, a sound of pure joy. "I'm just a cowboy's wife, George." "No," he corrected her, looking out at the thousands of people who were now standing, many of them wiping tears from their faces. "You're the queen, I just hold the guitar." They stood there for a long moment, soaking it in. The video that had threatened to tear them apart had, in the end, welded them together with a strength that was unbreakable. It had stripped away the celebrity and revealed the character. Later that night, back at the ranch, the lights were off. The applause was a memory. The adrenaline had faded. George and Norma lay in bed, the window open to the night air. The sounds of the Texas night, the crickets, the distant call of a coyote, were the only music left. George stared up at the ceiling fan spinning slowly in the dark. He thought about Sarah. He thought about Brad. He thought about the strange, terrifying, beautiful way the world worked. "George?" Norma's voice was sleepy beside him. "Yeah, darling. Do you think Sarah heard us tonight?" George turned his head on the pillow. He looked at the woman who had been his compass for 50 years. "I don't think she ever stopped listening," George said. "And I think tonight she finally got to see you smile." Norma reached out and found his hand in the dark, their fingers interlaced, a familiar lock, a knot that held fast against the world. "Good night, George." "Good night, Norma." Outside, the wind shifted, blowing through the mesquite trees, carrying the dust of the ranch and the secrets of 1,000 quiet kindnesses across the plains. The internet would move on to the next scandal, the next outrage, the next victim. But here, in the heart of Texas, the truth had set down roots deep enough to weather any storm. The legend wasn't the man with the guitar. The legend was the love that survived the silence.